A man rescues a strange dog trembling in the rain. Its fur so thick and filthy he can't even see its eyes. He brings it home, gives it a warm bath, and starts trimming away the matted hair. But as the layers fall away, he realizes it's not a dog at all. What he's really rescued will change everything he thought he knew about loyalty, family, and second chances. How did this animal end up like this? And what secret is it carrying that will pull him into a journey he never saw coming? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Jorge adjusted his tool belt with practiced hands, each motion automatic after 12 years on the job. The leather was worn smooth in places, telling its own story of countless repairs and quiet mornings just like this one. He picked up his silver thermos, still warm and full of the dark coffee he'd brewed at 5 a.m. in his empty apartment. The fluorescent lights in the hallway hummed overhead as he made his way through the building's morning routine. A young woman in business attire rushed past, her heels clicking against the tile floor. Jorge stepped aside, offering a small nod that went unnoticed as she checked her phone. He was used to it, being part of the building's background, like the pipes behind the walls, or the vents that circulated the air. His first stop was apartment 2C. Mrs. Henderson had reported a leaky faucet yesterday, marking it in the maintenance log with her neat handwriting. Jorge knocked softly on the door, waiting as shuffling footsteps approached from inside. "Oh, the tap. Yes, come in," Mrs. Henderson said, barely looking up from her morning paper. She waved vaguely toward the kitchen before returning to her breakfast nook. Jorge set his thermos down and knelt under the sink, his knees creaking slightly. The problem was obvious, a worn washer that had started to crack. He worked methodically, his movements efficient and quiet. The only sounds were the gentle clink of his tools and the rustle of newspaper pages turning in the other room. 10 minutes later, he tested the tap. The drip had stopped. "All fixed, ma'am," he called out. Came the distracted reply. Jorge gathered his tools and slipped out, closing the door softly behind him. Up on the third floor, apartment 3A needed attention. A loose cabinet hinge, according to the log. No one answered his knock, but Mr. Chen from 3A always left a note saying to enter and fix things while he was at work. Jorge found the cabinet door hanging awkwardly, its top hinge barely holding on. He reached into his tool belt for his screwdriver, the weight of it familiar in his hand. The morning light streamed through the kitchen window as he worked, casting long shadows across the counter. Someone's cat, he thought it belonged to 3B, watched him from the fire escape, its tail swishing back and forth against the metal grating. Jorge gave it a small wave, feeling slightly foolish afterward. When lunchtime came, Jorge made his way down to the basement storage room. It wasn't much, just a small space carved out between the water heater and some old paint cans. But it was quiet. He'd brought a sandwich from home, turkey and cheese on wheat bread. The first bite was interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. "Jorge? Are you in there?" Mr. Finch's voice carried through the metal door, his tone clipped and professional. Jorge swallowed quickly. "Yes, sir. Come in." The property manager stepped inside, his pressed shirt and tie looking out of place among the dusty storage boxes. Mr. Finch held his clipboard like a shield, tapping it with his pen in an agitated rhythm. "We've had complaints," he began, consulting his notes, though Jorge suspected he didn't need to. "Several tenants in the upper floors have reported strange noises at night. Scratching sounds, they say, coming from the roof area." Jorge set his sandwich down carefully on its wrapper. "Scratching sounds?" "Yes, and we can't have that sort of thing. Bad for retention rates." Mr. Finch's mouth twisted slightly. "I need you to check it out. After your regular shift, of course. Can't have you disrupting the tenants during business hours. I'll look into it tonight, Jorge said, knowing there wasn't really a choice in the matter. Good. Good. Mr. Finch made a mark on his clipboard. Let me know what you find. And Jorge, try to resolve it quickly. We don't need rumors about pest problems spreading through the building. He turned and left, the door clicking shut behind him. Jorge looked down at his half-eaten sandwich, his appetite diminished. The basement suddenly felt colder, and he pulled his work jacket closer around his shoulders. The rest of his shift passed in a blur of minor repairs. A stuck window in 4B, a loose doorknob in the lobby, a flickering light in the laundry room. By the time he returned to his apartment, his body ached with the familiar tiredness of a long day's work. He managed a simple dinner of microwaved leftovers and set his alarm for 10 p.m. The nap was brief but necessary, and when he woke, the building had settled into its nighttime quiet. Jorge changed into a fresh work shirt and gathered his equipment: flashlight, toolbox, and an extra battery just in case. The stairwell to the roof access was narrow and rarely used. His footsteps echoed off the concrete walls as he climbed, the beam of his flashlight bouncing ahead of him. A light rain had started to fall, creating a gentle patter against the metal door at the top. Jorge pushed it open, feeling the cool mist against his face. The roof stretched out before him, a flat expanse broken only by vents and air conditioning units. The city lights created an orange glow against the low clouds, casting everything in strange shadows. The wind picked up, sending a shiver down his spine. Water dripped from the edge of his flashlight as he swept it across the roof's surface. Everything looked normal at first, just wet concrete and metal vents gleaming in the artificial light. Then he heard it. A scratch, scratch, scratch coming from the far corner, near one of the larger ventilation units. The sound was faint but distinct, like something trying to get in or get out. Jorge adjusted his grip on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the rain as he moved closer to investigate. The scratching grew louder as he approached, and he found himself moving more cautiously, his shoes silent against the wet roof. The vent loomed ahead, dark and imposing in the night air. Jorge squinted into the darkness, his flashlight illuminating the metal surface as the scratching continued from somewhere just beyond its reach. The rain intensified, drumming against Jorge's shoulders as he approached the vent. His flashlight beam caught something that made him pause, a dark mass wedged tightly in the narrow space between the ventilation unit and an old HVAC system. At first, it looked like someone had stuffed a wet blanket into the gap, but then it moved. A weak growl emerged from the sodden bundle of fur, barely audible over the pattering rain. Jorge crouched down, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The beam of light revealed matted fur, dark with rain, and what might have been mud. The creature was trembling. Whether from fear or cold, he couldn't tell. "Easy there," Jorge murmured, his voice gentle like when he spoke to the building's cats. He set his toolbox down carefully, trying not to make any sudden movements. The animal's eyes caught the flashlight's beam, reflecting back with a dull glimmer. Nothing like the usual bright shine he'd expect from a healthy animal. Jorge balanced the flashlight on top of his toolbox, angling it to illuminate the tight space. The creature was thoroughly stuck, its fur caught on rough edges of metal and its body compressed by the narrow gap. It tried to growl again when Jorge shifted closer, but the sound came out more like a whimper. I know, he said softly, reaching for his toolbox. "Let's get you out of there." His hands moved with practiced efficiency as he selected his wire cutters. Some of the old vent housing had partially collapsed, creating sharp edges that had snagged the animal's fur. Jorge pulled a clean shop towel from his box and folded it carefully. He'd need it to protect both himself and the creature from the jagged metal. The rain ran down his neck as he worked, but Jorge barely noticed. His world narrowed to the task at hand, Clip, pull, gentle tug, pause when the animal flinched. The creature had stopped trying to growl, which worried him more than its earlier protests. Its eyes were half closed, its breathing shallow. "Almost there," Jorge assured it, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to comfort the animal or himself. The wire cutters made short work of a particularly twisted piece of metal that had been pinning the creature's hindquarters. Jorge had to admire whoever had installed the original vent housing. They'd used heavy-gauge material that had lasted decades. Unfortunately, that same durability was now working against them. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, Jorge cleared enough space to reach the animal. It was heavier than he expected, its wet fur adding to the weight. The creature didn't resist as he carefully wrapped it in his jacket, which worried him even more. Whatever this animal was, it should have been fighting harder. Jorge gathered the bundle close to his chest, trying to shield it from the rain. His toolbox could wait. He'd come back for it later. The back stairwell would be best. Fewer chances of running into curious tenants who might ask questions he wasn't ready to answer. The service stairs were narrow and poorly lit, but Jorge knew every step by heart. He'd climbed them countless times over the years, fixing everything from broken light fixtures to loose handrails. The animal in his arms barely moved as he descended, though he could feel its chest rising and falling against his own. Water dripped from both of them as Jorge made his way to his maintenance office in the basement. The space wasn't much, just a converted storage room with a desk, some shelves of supplies, and a small electric heater he'd installed himself. But it was private, and right now, that's what mattered most. Jorge nudged the door open with his foot, careful not to bump the bundle in his arms against the frame. The familiar smell of metal and cleaning supplies greeted him as he stepped inside. He'd never bothered decorating much, just a few technical manuals on the shelf and a calendar from the local hardware store. But there was an old rug in the corner that he used when he needed to work on floor-level repairs. He placed the wrapped animal gently on the rug, positioning it under the strong desk lamp he used for detailed work. The light revealed just how bedraggled the creature really was. Its fur was a mess of tangles and mats, some of them so thick they looked like felt. Dirt and debris were caught in the wet strands, and Jorge could see small cuts where the sharp metal had caught the animal's skin. "Let's get you cleaned up," he said quietly, reaching for the first aid kit he kept in his desk drawer. Inside was a pair of scissors he used for cutting gauze. They would work for trimming fur, too. He also grabbed a clean cloth and soaked it in warm water from the sink in the corner. The animal's eyes were fully closed now, but it was still breathing. Jorge started with the worst tangles first, carefully cutting away the matted fur. The scissors made soft snipping sounds in the quiet room. As he worked, wiping away grime with the damp cloth, something started to seem off. The fur beneath the tangles wasn't quite right for a dog. It was denser, with a different texture than he'd expected. And the face, as he cleaned away the mud and dried blood, the features began to emerge more clearly. The snout was too pointed, the ears too round. Jorge's hands slowed as realization dawned. He'd seen these markings before, on the creatures that sometimes raided the building's garbage bins at night. The distinctive mask-like pattern around the eyes, though dirty and disheveled, was unmistakable. This wasn't a lost pet or stray dog he'd rescued. It was a raccoon. Jorge checked his watch, 3 a.m. His eyes felt gritty, but he couldn't leave the raccoon yet. Its breathing seemed steadier since he'd cleaned it up. He found an old plastic laundry basket behind some paint cans. The raccoon watched as Jorge lined it with a clean towel from his locker, smoothing the fabric into soft ridges. "This'll have to do for now," he murmured. He gently lifted the raccoon, still wrapped in his jacket, noticing its fur was drying to a softer gray beneath the remaining grime. He placed it carefully in the makeshift bed. The raccoon curled into a tight ball, nose tucked under what remained of its tail. The sight tightened something in Jorge's chest. It looked so vulnerable. His growling stomach reminded him of his uneaten sandwich. The raccoon probably needed food too. Jorge took half a chicken breast from his mini fridge, tore it into small pieces on a paper plate, and filled a shallow saucer with water. He settled into his chair, watching the animal. The clock ticked as he wondered what to do next. He dozed occasionally, jerking awake at small sounds, while the raccoon remained still. Morning arrived with its usual building noises. Jorge changed shirts and splashed water on his face. The raccoon watched him, more alert now. "I'll be back," Jorge told it, feeling foolish for talking to a wild animal. His morning passed in distracted blur of repairs. By lunchtime, he hurried back to his office, unsure what he'd find. The raccoon remained in the basket. The chicken was gone, and the water nearly empty. It watched Jorge with calm interest as he refilled the water and ate his sandwich. That evening, Jorge bought fresh chicken, apples, and dog kibble from the corner store. The raccoon ate with stronger movements than before, then groomed itself and curled up again, eyes fixed on Jorge. The silence felt less empty, more peaceful. "Lucky," Jorge said, testing the name. The raccoon's ears twitched, but it remained relaxed. The name felt right. This creature had been lucky to survive, and perhaps Jorge had been lucky to find it. The next morning, Jorge arrived earlier than usual, his stomach tight with worry. He'd tossed and turned all night, imagining Lucky gone, or the office destroyed. But when he opened the door, Lucky was curled up in the laundry basket, peaceful as could be. The raccoon lifted its head and watched Jorge with those intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through him. "Still here, huh?" Jorge muttered, relief washing over him. He set down a paper bag containing half of his breakfast sandwich and some apple slices he'd cut up at home. This became his new routine. Every morning he'd bring something from home, leftovers from dinner, fruit, or bits of his own meals. In the evenings, he'd return with more food and spend time sitting quietly in the office, watching Lucky grow stronger day by day. The raccoon's fur was starting to look better too, growing back in patches where Jorge had needed to trim away the worst tangles. Its movements were becoming more fluid, more confident, though it never showed any sign of wanting to leave the safety of the office. Jorge found himself talking more, mostly just quiet comments about his day or what needed fixing in the building. Lucky would watch him intently, head tilted, as if understanding every word. It should have felt silly talking to a raccoon, but somehow it didn't. It felt natural, like Lucky was meant to be there. On the third day, Jorge was called to Apartment 4B to fix a garbage disposal. It was a simple job, one he'd done countless times before. He reached under the sink with his wrench, finding the reset button by touch alone. His other hand twisted the disposal's collar to free up the jam. That evening, back in his office, Jorge was organizing his tools when something caught his eye. Lucky had climbed out of the basket and was sitting by his toolbox. The raccoon's small hands were moving in a familiar pattern, twisting, turning, just like Jorge had done under the sink that morning. Jorge froze, watching in amazement as Lucky picked up a screwdriver, holding it exactly as he did. The raccoon turned it carefully, mimicking the motions Jorge used when tightening screws. A sound bubbled up from Jorge's chest, a laugh, rusty from disuse but genuine. Lucky looked up at the sound, head tilted curiously. Jorge couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed. The sound surprised him as much as Lucky's behavior. "You've been watching me work?" he asked softly, still smiling. Lucky set down the screwdriver and picked up a wrench, holding it with surprising dexterity. Jorge shook his head in wonder. "You're something else, aren't you?" The next day passed normally until late evening, when Jorge needed to check the ancient boiler in the basement. The old system had been acting up lately, making strange noises that worried him. He descended the narrow stairs to the boiler room, flashlight beam bouncing off pipes and dusty corners. As he leaned over to check the pressure gauge, his ring of master keys slipped from his belt. Jorge's heart stopped as he watched them fall, as if in slow motion, through the metal grate, covering a deep ventilation shaft. The keys hit the sides with a series of metallic clinks before disappearing into the darkness below. "No, no, no," Jorge muttered, dropping to his knees. He yanked at the grate, but it was sealed tight with decades-old bolts. His flashlight beam revealed nothing but blackness below. Those keys opened every door in the building. Without them, he couldn't do his job. Mr. Finch would have to be told, new keys would need to be made, and the building's security would be compromised. Jorge sat back on his heels, running a shaky hand through his hair. There was nothing he could do tonight. He'd have to face the music in the morning. With heavy steps, he climbed back to his office, dreading the conversation he'd have to have with management. He barely slept that night, his mind spinning with worst-case scenarios. When his alarm went off, he dressed slowly, trying to delay the inevitable. But when he opened his office door, something caught his eye. There, placed neatly in front of the boiler room door, was his ring of master keys. Jorge stared at them, unable to process what he was seeing. He picked them up with trembling hands. They were definitely his keys, complete with the scratch on the main door key and the bent corner of the maintenance room key. Moving quickly now, Jorge hurried to the security office. The night guard was just finishing his shift and nodded sleepily as Jorge sat down at the monitors. He rewound the footage from the previous night, hands shaking slightly as he operated the controls. The grainy black and white video showed the empty hallway at first. Then, around 2 a.m., something emerged from a small vent near the floor. Lucky. The raccoon moved purposefully down the hall, disappearing into another vent. 20 minutes later, Lucky reappeared, dragging something that glinted in the dim light. The keys. Jorge watched, amazed, as Lucky carefully placed the keys in front of the boiler room door, then slipped back through the vent and out of sight. The whole thing looked planned, deliberate, as if Lucky had known exactly what needed to be done. Jorge sat back in the chair, staring at the frozen image on the screen. Slowly, a smile spread across his face, not the small, polite one he used with tenants, but a real smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Lucky hadn't just helped him. The raccoon had solved a problem Jorge himself couldn't fix. He rewound the footage again, watching Lucky's careful movements. The raccoon had known which vents to use, how to navigate the building's maze of shafts, and most importantly, had understood that Jorge needed those keys. It was incredible. Back in his office, Jorge found Lucky curled up in the usual spot, seemingly asleep. But one eye opened as Jorge approached, watching him with what almost looked like satisfaction. "Thank you," Jorge said softly, holding up the keys. Lucky's whiskers twitched, and Jorge could have sworn the raccoon nodded slightly before closing its eye again. The morning sun had barely risen when Jorge finished his usual rounds. His tool belt felt lighter today, his steps quicker. The memory of Lucky's nighttime rescue of his keys kept playing in his mind, bringing an unfamiliar warmth to his chest. He clutched a brown paper bag from the corner store, filled with fresh groceries he'd picked up before his shift. Inside the maintenance room, Lucky was already awake, perched on the edge of the laundry basket that had become his temporary home. The raccoon's fur had a healthy sheen now, the matted tangles replaced by soft, clean fur that Jorge had carefully brushed out over the past few days. "Brought you something different today," Jorge said softly, setting his tool belt on the workbench. He pulled out a bunch of yellow bananas, a loaf of bread, and a carton of eggs. Lucky watched with obvious interest, nose twitching at the new smells. Jorge peeled one of the bananas and carefully sliced it into thin rounds on a paper plate. He placed it near Lucky's basket, stepping back to give the raccoon space. Lucky approached cautiously, whiskers forward, examining the unfamiliar food. After a careful sniff, he picked up a slice with his nimble fingers, turning it over before taking a small bite. Jorge couldn't help but smile as Lucky's eyes widened slightly. The raccoon quickly finished the first slice and reached for another, eating with delicate movements that seemed almost human-like. It was fascinating to watch those small hands handle the fruit with such care. Over the next several days, a new pattern emerged in Jorge's life. His mornings still started early, but now they began with breakfast, shared in comfortable silence with Lucky. The raccoon would wait patiently as Jorge divided his meals, always setting aside a portion for his unusual companion. Lucky began following Jorge on his rounds, staying close to the shadows and ducking out of sight whenever footsteps approached. In the boiler room, Lucky would watch intently as Jorge checked gauges and adjusted valves. The raccoon's eyes followed every movement, head tilted in that now familiar way that suggested deep concentration. "This here's the pressure valve," Jorge would explain in hushed tones, pointing to different parts of the machinery. "Gotta check it twice a day. Too high, and we've got problems. Too low, same thing." Lucky would move closer, touching the metal pipes with careful pause, as if memorizing their shape and function. In the mop closet, Jorge showed Lucky how to organize the cleaning supplies. "Everything has its place," he'd say, arranging bottles by size and type. Lucky would watch, then reach out to nudge a misaligned spray bottle back into position, making Jorge chuckle softly. When the building was quiet, usually during lunch hours or late at night, Jorge would even take Lucky upstairs. The raccoon moved silently beside him, stopping when Jorge stopped, moving when Jorge moved. They developed an unspoken language of gestures and glances that made Jorge feel understood in a way he hadn't experienced in years. "Hand me that Phillips head," Jorge would say while fixing a loose doorknob, and Lucky would study the tools laid out before selecting the correct screwdriver. The raccoon's accuracy in choosing tools was uncanny, as if he'd been paying attention to every repair job Jorge had ever done. During these quiet moments, Jorge found himself talking more than he had in years. He described each task, explained the purpose of different tools, and sometimes even shared small stories about his day. Lucky listened with unwavering attention, occasionally making soft chirping sounds that seemed like responses. "See this wrench?" Jorge would say, holding up the tool. "It's adjustable. Fits any size nut or bolt." Lucky would reach for it, carefully manipulating the adjustment wheel just as he'd seen Jorge do countless times before. The raccoon's ability to learn and adapt continued to amaze Jorge. As the days grew shorter and colder, Jorge noticed Lucky searching for warmer spots to rest. The laundry basket, while comfortable enough, didn't provide much insulation against the growing chill. One evening, Jorge brought in an old wooden crate he'd found in storage. He lined it with some of his old flannel shirts and added a soft blanket he'd bought specifically for Lucky. The raccoon approached the crate cautiously at first, sniffing the new bedding. Jorge had positioned it in a corner away from drafts, but still within sight of his workbench. Lucky circled the crate twice before climbing in, turning around several times like a dog making its bed. The raccoon settled into the soft fabric, whiskers twitching contentedly. Jorge sat in his chair nearby, a cup of coffee warming his hands. The familiar scent of coffee mixed with the metallic smell of tools and the faint mustiness of the basement. It should have felt lonely, like all his other nights in the maintenance room, but it didn't. Lucky's presence filled the space with something Jorge hadn't even realized was missing: companionship. The raccoon yawned widely, showing pink tongue and white teeth, before curling into a tight ball in his new bed. His breathing slowly evened out into the rhythm of sleep, but his ears still twitched occasionally at small sounds, staying alert even in rest. Jorge sipped his coffee, watching the gentle rise and fall of Lucky's breathing. The usual evening sounds of the building drifted down: footsteps above, the hum of the heating system, distant voices of tenants returning home. But here in this room, time seemed to slow down, to create a peaceful bubble around them. Through the small window near the ceiling, Jorge noticed something floating past the glass. He set down his coffee and moved closer, peering out at the night sky. Small white flakes were drifting down, the first snow of the season. They melted as soon as they touched the ground. But more kept falling, dancing in the yellow glow of the street lights. Jorge returned to his chair, picking up his coffee again. Lucky shifted slightly in his sleep, paw twitching as he dreamed. The maintenance room felt different now, transformed from a place where Jorge simply worked into something that felt more like home. As the snow continued to fall outside, Jorge realized that for the first time in longer than he could remember, the silence in the room felt comfortable rather than empty. The next morning arrived with a biting chill that seeped through the building's old walls. Jorge was making his usual rounds, checking the heating system floor by floor, when his walkie-talkie crackled to life. "Jorge, we need you in 6C. Ms. Langford has a complaint." Mr. Finch's clipped tone carried its usual note of irritation. Jorge's stomach tightened. He had been extra careful lately, but Ms. Langford was known for her sharp eyes and sharper tongue. He took the service elevator to the 6th floor, his tool belt feeling heavier with each passing second. Ms. Langford was waiting in her doorway, arms crossed. Her steel-gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her thin lips were pressed into a tight line. She didn't wait for Jorge to speak. "Look at this," she said, pointing to the hallway carpet. "Animal hair, everywhere. I pay good money to live in a clean building, not some kind of zoo." Jorge knelt down, examining the carpet. His heart skipped a beat when he spotted the familiar gray fur caught in the fibers. He'd been so careful to clean up after Lucky, but somehow he'd missed this. "I'm sorry, Ms. Langford," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Must be from someone's pet. I'll make sure to vacuum more thoroughly." She peered down at him through her reading glasses. "See that you do. And while you're at it, check the ventilation system. I've been hearing strange noises at night." Jorge nodded, already pulling out his vacuum from the nearby supply closet. He could feel Ms. Langford watching him as he worked, her presence like a shadow over his shoulder. Over the next few days, Jorge became even more cautious with Lucky. He studied the building's routines more carefully, noting when the halls were busiest, which tenants kept irregular hours, where the security cameras had blind spots. When Lucky needed to move between floors, Jorge would hide him in an old laundry cart, covering him with clean towels. The raccoon seemed to understand the need for secrecy, staying perfectly still during these transfers. Sometimes Jorge would catch Lucky watching him with those intelligent eyes, as if saying, "I know we have to be careful." They developed a silent language of gestures. A tap on the cart meant stay quiet. A specific whistle meant hide. Lucky picked up on these signals quickly, responding with an almost human-like understanding. One particularly busy afternoon, Jorge was called to apartment 4D to fix a malfunctioning thermostat. The tenant, an elderly man who took 20 minutes to explain a 2-minute problem, kept Jorge longer than expected. "And sometimes it makes this clicking sound," the tenant was saying, demonstrating by tapping the thermostat with his finger. "But only on Tuesdays, or maybe Wednesdays." Jorge nodded patiently, though his mind was on Lucky, left alone in the storage room. He'd been gone longer than usual, and Lucky had been restless lately, curious about the building's many sounds and smells. As if manifesting his fears, Jorge's peripheral vision caught movement in the hallway. A familiar gray shape slipping past the apartment door. His heart stopped. Lucky had somehow gotten out. Jorge quickly finished the thermostat repair, his hands trembling slightly as he replaced the cover. "All set," he said, cutting off the tenant's newest observation about the clicking sound. "Call if you need anything else." He stepped into the hallway, scanning desperately for any sign of Lucky. The corridor was empty, but he could hear footsteps approaching from around the corner. Jorge moved quickly, checking behind potted plants and under the hallway bench. Then he heard it, the sharp intake of breath that made his blood run cold. At the end of the hall stood Ms. Langford, her eyes fixed on something near the service elevator. Lucky had frozen in place, caught in the act of investigating a dropped piece of paper. Time seemed to stop. Ms. Langford didn't scream or make a scene. She simply stared, her expression shifting from surprise to recognition to something harder. Without a word, she turned and walked briskly toward the main elevator. Jorge whistled softly, their signal for danger, and Lucky immediately darted back toward the storage room. Jorge followed, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew what was coming. That evening, as Jorge was organizing his tools for the next day's work, his walkie-talkie crackled again. "Jorge, my office. Now!" Mr. Finch's voice was cold and flat. The walk to the property manager's office felt like walking to his own execution. Jorge's footsteps echoed in the empty hallway, each step bringing him closer to what he'd been dreading since taking Lucky in. Mr. Finch sat behind his desk, illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lights that made his balding head shine. He didn't look up from his paperwork as Jorge entered. "Sit down," he said, still not looking up. Jorge lowered himself into the uncomfortable plastic chair across from the desk. The silence stretched out, broken only by the scratch of Mr. Finch's pen against paper. Finally, Mr. Finch set down his pen and looked up. His eyes were hard. "Ms. Langford came to see me today. She had some interesting things to say about what she saw in the hallway." Jorge said nothing, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Now I'm going to say this once," Mr. Finch continued, leaning forward slightly. "If I find out you're keeping a wild animal in this building, you're done. No warnings, no second chances. Done. Do you understand?" Jorge nodded, his throat too dry to speak. "Good." Mr. Finch picked up his pen again, a clear dismissal. "Clean the hallways better, and fix whatever's making those noises in the vents." Jorge returned to the storage room, his steps heavy. Lucky was waiting, hidden under a towel in his crate, only his nose visible. The raccoon seemed to sense the tension in the air, staying perfectly still except for his eyes, which followed Jorge's movements across the room. Jorge sank into his chair, the weight of Mr. Finch's warning settling over him like a heavy blanket. Lucky remained under the towel, as if understanding that tonight was not a night for their usual quiet companionship. 2 mornings later, Jorge descended the basement stairs with his usual thermos of coffee, the metal steps creaking beneath his work boots. The fluorescent lights flickered to life as he hit the switch, casting harsh shadows across the maze of pipes and water tanks. He took 2 steps into the room before freezing. There, nestled between the main water tanks, sat a metal cage. It wasn't particularly large, but its presence felt enormous in the confined space. The steel bars gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and through them, Jorge could see fresh apple slices arranged in a neat row. A yellow tag hung from the top of the cage, its official lettering making his heart sink. City Wildlife Control. Jorge's coffee thermos slipped from his fingers, clattering against the concrete floor. The sound echoed through the basement, seeming to bounce off every pipe and corner. He quickly retrieved it, his hand shaking slightly as he set it on a nearby shelf. Moving closer to the trap, Jorge examined it without touching it. The mechanism was simple but effective, a pressure plate that would snap the door shut when triggered. The apple slices were fresh, probably placed there early this morning. Someone had reported Lucky. Someone had called the authorities. His mind raced to Ms. Langford, to Mr. Finch, to any of the dozens of tenants who might have glimpsed something unusual in the past weeks. It didn't matter who had done it now. What mattered was getting rid of the evidence before Lucky discovered it. With trembling hands, Jorge lifted the trap carefully. It was lighter than he expected, the metal warm from the nearby water heaters. He carried it quickly to the maintenance hallway closet, tucking it behind some old paint cans and drop cloths where it wouldn't be immediately visible. His heart was pounding as he returned to the basement. Lucky was still in his usual spot, thankfully unaware of the danger that had been waiting for him. Jorge knew they couldn't stay here, not with wildlife control aware of the situation. The water tank chamber had been unused for years, ever since the building upgraded its system. It was a small room off the main basement, originally designed to house auxiliary water tanks that were never installed. Jorge had used it for storage occasionally, but most people had forgotten it existed. He spent the next hour clearing the space, moving old equipment and supplies to other storage areas. The room was perfect, windowless, with thick concrete walls that would muffle any sounds. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, controlled by a switch outside the door. Jorge worked methodically, his movements precise despite his anxiety. He brought in Lucky's bedding, some water bowls, and enough supplies to last several days. The raccoon watched from his current spot, head tilted curiously at the unusual activity. When everything was ready, Jorge coaxed Lucky into the new space. The raccoon explored cautiously, sniffing at the corners and examining the new surroundings. Jorge installed a second padlock on the door, an extra precaution against any maintenance workers who might have keys to the first one. He adjusted the light to keep it dim, knowing Lucky preferred softer lighting. The space wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. Jorge couldn't risk Lucky being caught, not now. That evening, after finishing his regular maintenance duties, Jorge sat at his small desk in the maintenance office. His ancient laptop hummed as he searched through pages of urban wildlife regulations. Each new tab he opened confirmed his worst fears. According to the city codes, keeping wildlife as pets was strictly prohibited. The fines were steep, and the penalties could include jail time. Jorge scrolled through article after article about raccoons in particular. They were considered rabies vector species, requiring special permits even for licensed rehabilitators. The information about domesticated raccoons was even more troubling. Most had been raised illegally as pets, taken from their mothers too young. They never learned the survival skills they needed for life in the wild. Releasing them into the city or forest was essentially a death sentence. They didn't know how to find food, avoid predators, or survive extreme weather. Lucky's behavior made more sense now. His comfort around humans, his ability to understand tools and gestures, his lack of typical raccoon aggression, these were all signs of early human contact. Someone had raised him, then abandoned him when he grew too large or difficult to manage. Jorge's eyes burned from staring at the screen. He closed several tabs about wildlife removal services, unable to bear reading more about their humane disposal methods. The clock on his laptop showed 11:47 p.m. He'd been researching for hours. Closing the laptop with a soft click, Jorge rubbed his tired eyes. The fluorescent office lights seemed especially harsh after hours of screen time. He looked over at Lucky, who had followed him up from the new hiding spot and was now curled up beside an unplugged space heater in the corner. The raccoon's fur had filled out nicely since that rainy night on the roof. His coat was thick and healthy now, his eyes bright and alert. He looked so peaceful, so at home in this cluttered maintenance office. "I don't know how long we can keep this up," Jorge whispered into the quiet room. Lucky blinked slowly at the sound of Jorge's voice, then stretched out one paw to rest his head on Jorge's boot. The simple gesture of trust made Jorge's chest tighten. He had saved Lucky that night, but now he realized Lucky had saved something in him too, something he hadn't even known was missing. The raccoon's steady breathing and warm weight against his foot grounded Jorge in the moment, pushing away thoughts of traps and regulations and consequences. For now, they were safe. For now, this was enough. The week after the trap incident crept by with unusual quietness. Jorge adjusted his routines, moving like a shadow through the building's early morning hours when most tenants were still asleep. He scheduled repairs before sunrise or after sunset, timing his movements to avoid curious eyes. Lucky stayed hidden in the water tank chamber, emerging only when Jorge gave their special signal, 3 soft taps on the metal door. Every morning, Jorge arrived an hour earlier than usual, using the pre-dawn darkness to carry fresh food and water to Lucky. In the evenings, he waited until the last load of laundry was done, until the halls fell silent before sneaking Lucky out for brief explorations of the basement level. The raccoon seemed to understand the need for extra caution, moving with deliberate stealth and ducking into shadows whenever distant footsteps echoed down the stairwell. On Thursday afternoon, the peaceful routine shattered. Jorge was replacing a broken light fixture in the third-floor hallway when he heard the first shouts. Voices carried up the stairwell, urgent and frightened. He descended quickly, his tool belt jingling against his hip. The lobby was filling with tenants, their voices overlapping in a chorus of concern. At the center of the crowd stood Mrs. Chen from apartment 4D, her hands trembling as she spoke to Mr. Finch. "Leo was just playing in the laundry room," she said, her voice cracking. "I only stepped out for 5 minutes to get more quarters. When I came back, he was gone." Jorge knew Leo, a quiet 7-year-old who often sat alone in the lobby, watching people come and go. The boy would sometimes wave to Jorge when he passed, though they'd never spoken. Now he was missing, and the building was quickly descending into chaos. Mr. Finch took charge, directing tenants to search their floors. Someone had already called the police. Jorge offered to help, stepping forward with his knowledge of the building's layout, but Mr. Finch barely glanced his way. "Just stick to your regular duties," he said dismissively, turning back to organize the search parties. Jorge watched the groups disperse, heading up stairwells and down corridors. He knew they'd miss places, the crawl spaces, the maintenance ducts, the forgotten corners where a small boy might wander or hide. Without a word, he turned and headed for the basement. The boiler room hummed with its usual mechanical heartbeat as Jorge entered, flashlight beam cutting through the dim light. He'd brought Lucky down here earlier, knowing the raccoon would be safe among the maze of pipes while Jorge worked upstairs. Now Lucky sat alert by the main boiler, his ears perked forward, nose twitching at the air. Jorge began his systematic search, checking behind equipment and inside the larger ventilation ducts. He'd covered half the room when Lucky suddenly became agitated. The raccoon's paws scraped against a loose vent cover near the floor, his movements frantic and purposeful. Before Jorge could move closer, Lucky darted away from the vent, running down a narrow side corridor that branched off from the main boiler room. It was an older section of the basement that Jorge rarely visited, home to outdated electrical panels and abandoned maintenance equipment. The fluorescent lights flickered uncertainly overhead as Jorge followed, his flashlight beam bouncing off grimy walls. Lucky moved with determination, leading Jorge deeper into the building's forgotten spaces. They passed the old laundry chute, its metal door hanging askew on rusted hinges, and rounded a corner Jorge hadn't known existed. The corridor ended at a supply closet, its door closed but not completely latched. Jorge's heart pounded as he approached. Lucky pawed at the bottom of the door, making soft chirping sounds, a behavior Jorge had never seen before. With trembling fingers, Jorge turned the handle. The beam of his flashlight illuminated a small figure huddled in the corner. Leo sat with his knees pulled to his chest, his face tear-streaked, but his eyes wide and alert. He squinted against the sudden light. "Hey there," Jorge said softly, crouching down to the boy's level. "Everyone's been looking for you." Leo sniffled, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "I was exploring," he said in a small voice. "But the door closed behind me. I couldn't open it from inside." Jorge noticed the old spring mechanism on the door. It must have swung shut automatically, trapping Leo in the darkness. The boy could have been stuck here for hours if Lucky hadn't somehow sensed his presence. "Let's get you back to your mom," Jorge said gently, holding out his hand. Lucky had already disappeared back down the corridor, understanding as always when to make himself scarce. Leo took Jorge's hand, his small fingers cold from the basement air. Jorge lifted him easily, carrying him through the maze of corridors and back toward the stairs. By the time they emerged into the lobby, Leo had stopped trembling. The police had arrived, their radios crackling with static as they coordinated with searching tenants. Mrs. Chen's cry of relief cut through the noise as she spotted her son in Jorge's arms. She rushed forward, gathering Leo into a tight embrace as tears streamed down her face. Questions followed. Where had Leo been found? How had Jorge known where to look? But in the commotion of reunion and relief, no one pressed too hard for details. Jorge simply mentioned checking the old maintenance areas, his voice quiet and matter-of-fact. No one asked about the coincidence of his search pattern or how he'd chosen that particular corridor to explore. The excitement gradually died down. The police left, tenants returned to their apartments, and the building settled back into its normal rhythm. Mr. Finch didn't even thank Jorge before heading home for the day. That evening, Jorge sat in his maintenance office, the events of the afternoon still playing through his mind. He'd brought up 2 plates of leftover lasagna from his apartment, one for himself, one for Lucky. The raccoon perched on an overturned bucket beside Jorge's chair, eating with his usual careful movements. They shared the meal in comfortable silence, the only sounds being the distant hum of the building systems and the soft scrape of forks against plates. Jorge glanced at his companion, wondering not for the first time at the strange turns life could take. A few months ago, he'd eaten every meal alone. Now he shared his table and his life with a raccoon who had just helped save a lost child. Lucky paused in his eating to look up at Jorge, whiskers twitching slightly. There was understanding in that gaze, a depth of connection that needed no words to express. Jorge nodded slightly, and they both returned to their meals, 2 unlikely friends sharing a quiet moment in their hidden corner of the world. The morning sun filtered through the lobby windows, casting long shadows across the freshly mopped floor. The excitement from yesterday's events had settled into a quiet buzz of conversation among the early risers. 2 police officers stood by the front desk, accepting coffee and thanks from grateful tenants while they filled out their final report. Jorge kept his head down, focusing on the loose stair rail that needed attention. His tool belt clinked softly as he worked, the familiar motions of tightening bolts and testing the stability helping to keep his mind occupied. He could hear snippets of conversation floating around him. "It's amazing they found him so quickly," Mrs. Peterson from 5B was saying to her neighbor. "In such a big building, he could have been anywhere." That maintenance man must know every inch of this place, someone else replied. What's his name again? George? Jorge, Mrs. Chen corrected softly. She stood near the mailboxes, her hand resting protectively on Leo's shoulder. The boy was quiet, but seemed recovered from his ordeal, occasionally glancing in Jorge's direction with a thoughtful expression. Jorge pretended not to hear them, adjusting his grip on the wrench and double-checking the rail's stability. He'd learned long ago that invisibility was easier when you acted like you expected it. Still, he couldn't help noticing when Leo slipped away from his mother and approached the stairs. Thank you, the boy said simply, his voice barely above a whisper. Jorge paused in his work, offering a small nod. Be careful in the basement from now on, okay? He replied quietly. Leo nodded seriously before returning to his mother's side. The morning passed slowly, filled with routine tasks that kept Jorge moving through the building's familiar spaces. He fixed a squeaky door hinge on the 4th floor, replaced some burnt-out bulbs in the emergency stairwell, and began the weekly task of cleaning the hallway carpets. The industrial carpet cleaner hummed loudly as Jorge guided it down the 6th-floor corridor. He was so focused on maintaining straight lines in the damp carpet that he almost missed the voices coming from around the corner. He slowed the machine, the sound dropping enough for him to make out Ms. Langford's sharp tone. I'm telling you, Mr. Finch, I saw it again. Her voice carried clearly despite her attempt at a whisper. Near the storage tanks, that rat thing. And your maintenance man was right there with it. Jorge's hands tightened on the carpet cleaner's handle. He could picture Ms. Langford's face, pinched with disapproval and self-righteous concern. Mr. Finch's response was harder to hear, but his tone was clipped and professional. We'll handle it, Finch said curtly. Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Ms. Langford. Jorge waited until their footsteps faded before continuing with the carpet. His movements were mechanical now, his mind racing with worry. The careful routine he'd built with Lucky felt suddenly fragile, like a house of cards ready to collapse. Back in the maintenance room, Jorge found Lucky waiting by the old filing cabinet where they kept their tools. The raccoon's intelligent eyes followed Jorge as he paced the small space, running his hands through his graying hair. Lucky seemed to sense his anxiety, staying closer than usual. Jorge tried to focus on organizing supplies and checking inventory lists. The afternoon dragged on, each knock at the door making Jorge's heart skip. But it wasn't until evening, after most tenants had returned home, that he found it, the new trap. It was partially hidden beneath the service stairs, tucked behind some old paint cans. This one was larger than the first, with a heavy spring mechanism and a generous dollop of peanut butter spread inside. Jorge carefully disabled the trap, his hands shaking slightly as he worked. Lucky watched from a few feet away, whiskers twitching at the smell of peanut butter, but making no move to investigate. The raccoon had grown more subdued since overhearing the conversation upstairs, as if understanding the gravity of their situation. They spent that evening in the maintenance room, Jorge attempting to catch up on paperwork while Lucky dozed nearby. Every distant sound made them both tense, expecting another inspection or confrontation. The night passed slowly, neither of them fully relaxing. Morning came too quickly. Jorge had just finished his first cup of coffee when a sharp knock echoed through the maintenance room. Lucky disappeared behind a stack of boxes as Mr. Finch entered without waiting for a response. The property manager stood in the doorway, his posture rigid and his expression stern. He didn't bother with pleasantries or small talk. "You've been warned," he said, each word precise and cold. "The next complaint, you're out. No negotiations." Jorge nodded, swallowing hard against the emotion rising in his throat. He wanted to explain about Lucky, about how the raccoon had helped find Leo, about the quiet companionship they'd found in each other. but he knew it wouldn't matter. Rules were rules, and Finch was a man who lived by them. The door closed with a final sounding click, leaving Jorge alone with his thoughts and a hidden Lucky. The day passed in a blur of routine tasks, each one feeling somehow heavier than usual. Jorge found himself memorizing small details. The way Lucky's paws moved delicately over tools, the soft chittering sound he made when pleased, the warmth of his presence during their shared meals. That night, Jorge couldn't sleep. He sat in the old office chair, watching Lucky curled up in his makeshift bed. The raccoon's chest rose and fell with peaceful breaths, unaware of the weight of decisions and consequences hanging in the air. Jorge's eyes burned with fatigue and emotion as he watched his friends sleep, knowing their time together was running out. The maintenance room felt smaller than usual, the walls pressing in with the reality of their situation. The steady hum of the building systems provided a familiar backdrop to Jorge's troubled thoughts. Lucky shifted in his sleep, one paw twitching as he dreamed, and Jorge felt the sharp ache of impending loss settle deeper in his chest. For the first time in 12 years, Jorge called in sick to work. His voice was steady as he left a message on Mr. Finch's voicemail, but his hands trembled slightly as he hung up the phone. The maintenance room felt different in the morning light. Usually by this hour, he'd be halfway through his first round of repairs. Lucky watched from his favorite spot near the filing cabinet as Jorge set up his old laptop on the desk. The screen flickered to life, casting a blue glow across the cluttered space. Jorge's fingers moved slowly across the keyboard, typing "Wildlife Rehabilitation Centers near me" into the search bar. The results were overwhelming. Dozens of facilities appeared, their websites filled with photos of injured animals and success stories. Jorge clicked through them methodically, making notes on a worn notepad. With each new page, his heart sank a little further. "Full capacity, not accepting new animals," read one website. "Emergency cases only," stated another. "Must be under 6 months old for admission," declared a third. Jorge glanced at Lucky, who was now investigating an empty cardboard box with careful pause. The raccoon was clearly full-grown, probably around 2 or 3 years old based on his size. His movements were too precise, too practiced to be those of a juvenile animal. The morning stretched into afternoon. Jorge's coffee went cold beside him as he dove deeper into wildlife forums and rescue sites. Lucky occasionally brought him tools from around the room, a screwdriver, a wrench, even an old paintbrush, as if trying to remind Jorge of their usual routine. Each time, Jorge would pause his research to accept the offering, his throat tight with emotion. Around 2 o'clock, Jorge found a local forum dedicated to urban wildlife. The interface was basic, but the discussion seemed active and knowledgeable. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for several minutes before he began typing, "Need advice about adult raccoon. Found injured on roof 3 weeks ago. Now recovered but shows unusual behavior. Very calm, understands tools, mimics human actions. Not aggressive. Good with people, but likely a legal pet, abandoned. Can't release to wild, too domesticated. Need help finding safe option." He hit post before he could second-guess himself. Lucky had wandered over to watch the screen, his whiskers twitching at the reflection. Jorge reached down to scratch behind the raccoon's ears, a gesture that had become natural over their weeks together. Responses began appearing within the hour. Most were well-meaning but unhelpful. Suggestions to call animal control or warnings about rabies. Jorge's stomach churned at the thought of Lucky being treated like a dangerous pest. Then a new reply appeared from a user named Marla. "Hi there. I work with Urban Wildlife Rehabilitation. Your description suggests this raccoon was likely hand-raised from a young age. The tool recognition and mimicry are fascinating but concerning. Definitely indicates significant human contact. Would you be willing to discuss this privately? I might be able to help. My number is... Jorge read the message 3 times. Lucky had settled against his leg, a warm presence that made the decision both easier and harder. With careful movements, Jorge picked up his phone and dialed the number. The call connected on the second ring. Hello? The voice was female, steady and professional, but kind. I'm calling about the raccoon post, Jorge said quietly. It was strange hearing his own voice. He spoke so rarely these days. Yes, thank you for calling, Marla replied. Can you tell me more about how you found him? Jorge found himself describing everything. The stormy night on the roof, the tangled fur, the slow recovery. He explained Lucky's intelligence, his gentle nature, the way he helped with maintenance tasks. His voice grew stronger as he spoke about their daily routine, the quiet companionship they'd found. Marla listened without interruption. When Jorge finally fell silent, she asked careful, specific questions about Lucky's health, behavior, and abilities. Her tone remained practical but compassionate. Based on what you're describing, she said finally, this raccoon has clearly been socialized with humans from a very young age. The tool recognition is extraordinary. I've worked with hundreds of raccoons, and this level of behavior mimicry is unique. It suggests he was probably kept as an illegal pet and abandoned when he got too big. Jorge watched Lucky examining a loose screw on the desk. What? What should I do? Well, Marla said thoughtfully, the good news is he trusts you more than anyone right now. That's actually crucial for his chances of finding proper placement. Would you be willing to let me assess him in person? I promise complete discretion. I might be able to help find him a suitable sanctuary or educational facility. Relief and anxiety warred in Jorge's chest. You won't call animal control? No, Marla assured him firmly. My goal is finding the best outcome for both the animal and the people who care about them. Sometimes that means thinking creatively within the legal framework we have. They discussed logistics in low voices. Marla suggested meeting early the next morning at the edge of the city park, before most people were out. She gave him specific directions to a quiet corner near the old maintenance shed. After hanging up, Jorge sat in silence for a long moment. Lucky had finished with the screw and was now methodically cleaning crumbs from an old shop cloth. His movements precise and deliberate. The sight made Jorge's chest ache with a mixture of pride and sadness. With slow, careful movements, Jorge began gathering supplies. He found an old milk crate behind some boxes and checked it for sharp edges or loose wires. The plastic was sturdy but flexible, with plenty of ventilation holes. He located some bungee cords in good condition and a soft blanket that Lucky particularly liked. Working quietly, Jorge began transforming the milk crate into a temporary carrier. He threaded the bungee cords through the holes to create a secure top that could be easily opened. The blanket was folded to provide both comfort and privacy. Every few minutes he glanced at Lucky, who continued his methodical cleaning, seemingly unaware of the significance of these preparations. Jorge's hands moved automatically through the familiar motions of problem-solving and repair, but his mind was racing. The weight of tomorrow's meeting pressed against his thoughts. He checked and double-checked the carrier's security, adjusted the blanket's position, tested the bungee cord closure multiple times. Each movement felt heavy with meaning, laden with the possibility of goodbye. The morning air bit sharp and cold as Jorge slipped through the service entrance. The milk crate felt heavy, not from Lucky's weight, but from what was to come. Inside, Lucky watched through ventilation holes, occasionally touching the blanket with curious paws. Jorge had barely slept. The sky was turning from black to deep blue as he navigated back streets, his breath forming white puffs. He constantly checked the crate, keeping it level. The city was peaceful at this hour. Jorge stuck to delivery alleys and service paths, hiding when a newspaper truck passed. Through the plastic, he felt Lucky's warmth. Lucky made no sound, but shifted occasionally. Once, his paw reached through a hole to touch Jorge's wrist. Jorge swallowed hard and continued. The park's iron gates loomed ahead. Jorge followed Marla's directions to a side path. Frost glittered on benches in the dawn light. A white van was already parked there. A woman in practical clothes stood beside it, checking her phone. She looked up as Jorge approached, her expression professional. "You must be Jorge," she said. "I'm Marla. Thank you for coming." Jorge nodded silently and set the crate on a bench. Marla approached slowly. "May I?" she asked. Jorge nodded again. Marla knelt to observe Lucky without touching him, making soft sounds when he investigated her. "Remarkable," she murmured. "That's not typical wild raccoon behavior. He's problem-solving, not frantically trying to escape." She stood. "You were right. He was definitely hand-raised. Someone kept him as an illegal pet, then abandoned him when he got too big." Jorge's hands clenched. "He can't just go back outside." Marla shook her head. "That would be a death sentence. But there are sanctuaries for cases like this. You'd be welcome to visit. Lucky trusts you, and that bond is valuable." Jorge stared at Lucky's paw pressed against the plastic. He couldn't respond, words trapped in his chest. Marla opened the van, revealing a clean, organized space. Together, they secured the crate with padded straps. Marla added water and fresh fruit, while Lucky watched calmly. When finished, Marla gave Jorge her card. "Call any time, for updates or questions." Jorge took it numbly. Marla smiled, then drove away. Jorge stood motionless as the van disappeared. When he finally returned to the building, the maintenance room felt wrong. Too empty. The space where Lucky's bed had been echoed with absence. That evening, his sandwich sat untouched. Jorge stared at nothing, listening to the building's familiar sounds that now emphasized the silence. Sleep refused to come. Jorge lay in his chair, eyes open, feeling the room grow larger and emptier with each passing hour. The maintenance room felt different now. Jorge moved through his morning routine like a machine set to repeat the same actions over and over. Coffee, tool belt, clipboard, keys. Each item seemed heavier than before, weighted with memories of Lucky watching him prepare for the day's work. A week had passed since the early morning drive to the park. The building continued its usual rhythm: leaky faucets, stuck windows, temperamental thermostats. Jorge fixed them all with the same quiet efficiency he'd always shown. But something was missing from his movements. The satisfaction of completing each task had dulled, like a photo left too long in the sun. He caught himself talking aloud sometimes, explaining a repair to an empty room before remembering there were no alert eyes watching him work, no clever paws mimicking his movements. The silence in these moments felt thick enough to touch. Mr. Finch had stopped giving him suspicious looks in the hallways. The property manager seemed satisfied that whatever problem had existed was now resolved. He'd even nodded at Jorge yesterday, a brief acknowledgement that things were back to normal. But normal didn't feel the same anymore. The maintenance room's familiar corners now held empty spaces where Lucky's presence had been. The old laundry basket Jorge had used as a bed still sat in its corner, though he'd removed the blankets days ago. Sometimes his eyes would catch on it during his lunch break, and his sandwich would taste like cardboard in his mouth. The building's tenants went about their lives, unaware of the change in their basement. Ms. Langford complained about her sticky doorknob. The couple in 4B needed their garbage disposal fixed again. The young family in 2A had a clogged toilet. Jorge handled each issue with his usual quiet competence, but he no longer lingered to double-check his work. There was no one waiting to learn from his example anymore. One particularly busy afternoon, Jorge returned to the maintenance room after unclogging a shower drain in 5C. He was thinking about ordering replacement washers for the building's older faucets when something white caught his eye. An envelope had been slipped under his door, resting against the concrete floor. Jorge picked it up carefully. The paper was thick, professional-looking, with his name written in neat handwriting on the front. He recognized Marla's signature from the business card she'd given him, which he'd been carrying in his wallet since that morning in the park. Setting down his tool belt, Jorge sank into his chair and opened the envelope with careful movements. Inside was a letter, written in the same neat hand as the envelope. He began to read. Dear Jorge, I wanted to update you on Lucky's progress at the sanctuary. He's adjusting well to his new environment, though he does things his own way, much like someone else I know. He's eating regularly and has started exploring his enclosure more each day. What's particularly interesting is how he interacts with our handlers. While most rehabilitated raccoons either avoid human contact or become overly dependent, Lucky shows a unique balance. He allows us to check on him and even touch him, but he maintains his independence. It's clear he was taught to respect boundaries while still trusting humans, something that speaks volumes about his time with you. He's quiet, but smart. We've noticed him watching our maintenance staff work, just like you described. Yesterday, he figured out how to unscrew the lid of his feeding station, not to make a mess, but seemingly just to understand how it worked. Then he carefully screwed it back on. I think he misses you. He has a way of watching the sanctuary entrance when we do morning rounds, as if he's looking for someone specific. We've given him some basic tools to play with, nothing sharp, of course, and he handles them with surprising gentleness, almost like he's mimicking remembered movements. Jorge had to pause reading for a moment. He rubbed his eyes, telling himself it was just the fluorescent lighting making them sting. When he continued, he noticed a photograph tucked behind the letter. It showed Lucky in a spacious enclosure, natural-looking with trees and climbing structures. The raccoon was sitting near a small pool, methodically examining a tennis ball. His fur looked clean and healthy, his eyes bright and alert. The letter continued, which brings me to another reason for writing. Our sanctuary isn't just about housing animals. We're focused on rehabilitation and education. We need people who understand these animals, who can see them as individuals while respecting their wild nature. Your connection with Lucky showed exactly that balance. We'd like to offer you part-time work with us. It would be weekend shifts to start, working with our rehabilitation team. Lucky trusts you, and that matters more than any formal training. We can teach the technical aspects, but trust has to be earned. Think about it. No pressure, no deadlines. Just know there's a place here if you want it. Best regards, Marla. P.S. Lucky has claimed a specific wrench as his favorite toy. I've included a photo so you can see for yourself how well he's doing. Jorge read the letter twice more, his fingers careful not to crease the paper. Then he folded it precisely, matching the original creases, and slipped it into his coat pocket along with the photo. The weight of it there felt significant, like a key he wasn't quite ready to use. That evening, as he made his final rounds, Jorge walked through the basement hallway with his flashlight beam sweeping the familiar walls. He checked each door, each storage room, each utility closet, the same routine he'd followed for years. But when he reached the old vent shaft, his footsteps slowed to a stop. The metal grate still showed slight marks where Lucky had squeezed through to retrieve Jorge's dropped keys. Jorge stood there in the dim light, staring at the vent in silence. The memory of that morning played in his mind. His panic at losing the keys, the surprise of finding them by the door, the security footage that showed Lucky's determined effort to help. A faint smile crossed Jorge's face, just a slight softening around his eyes and mouth. It was the first time he'd smiled in a week. He reached out and touched the vent grate briefly, then continued his rounds, the letter a steady weight against his chest. 3 days after receiving Marla's letter, Jorge stood at the entrance of the Urban Wildlife Recovery Project, his work boots planted firmly on the gravel driveway. He'd changed his clothes twice that morning, settling finally on clean jeans and a navy button-down shirt, casual enough for manual work but neater than his usual maintenance uniform. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, empty except for 2 pickup trucks and a white van he recognized from the park. The facility wasn't what he'd expected. Tucked behind a row of industrial buildings on the city's outskirts, it looked more like a collection of connected workshops than a traditional animal shelter. A simple metal gate stood open, leading to a courtyard surrounded by low buildings with metal roofs. A weathered wooden sign hung above the entrance. Urban Wildlife Recovery Project, painted in faded green letters. Jorge checked his watch. 9:45 a.m. Marla had said to come at 10. He'd left home an hour early, not wanting to risk being late, and now found himself shifting his weight from foot to foot, uncertain whether to enter or wait. The sound of activity drifted from somewhere inside, voices calling instructions, the clang of metal bowls, running water. Before he could decide, Marla appeared in the gateway. She wore the same practical boots he remembered from their first meeting, along with cargo pants and a navy polo shirt with the sanctuary's logo. Her smile was warm, but not overwhelming. "Right on time," she said, though Jorge knew he was early. "Come on in. I'll show you around." She led him through the courtyard, explaining as they walked. The main building housed medical facilities and food preparation areas. Smaller structures contained supplies, quarantine spaces, and specialized recovery rooms. Everything was clean, but clearly well used, with the comfortable wear of a place where real work happened daily. They passed rows of enclosures, each designed differently. Some had pools, others climbing structures. Marla pointed out various residents, a one-eyed owl, a fox with a healed leg injury, several orphaned squirrels being prepared for release. Jorge nodded at each explanation, noting the careful organization of feeding schedules and maintenance routines posted outside each space. Near the back of the property, Marla slowed her pace. They approached a shaded enclosure set slightly apart from the others. Jorge's heart beat faster as they drew closer. The space was larger than many others, with natural branches, a small pool, and various platforms at different heights. In one corner, partially hidden by a pile of shredded newspaper, lay a familiar form. Lucky lifted his head as they approached, his movements calm and deliberate. He didn't rush to the fence or make any sound, but his eyes fixed immediately on Jorge. The raccoon's fur looked glossy in the morning light, his frame solid and healthy. He had been well cared for. Jorge knelt slowly beside the enclosure's mesh wall, his movements careful and measured, the same way he'd approached Lucky that first night on the roof. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Lucky rose and padded across the enclosure floor, his gait unhurried but purposeful. He came right to where Jorge knelt and pressed his head lightly against the mesh, just firm enough for Jorge to feel the pressure. Marla stayed quiet, letting the moment stretch naturally. When Lucky finally stepped back, she spoke softly. "He's been waiting for you, I think. Want to see how we run things here?" The next few hours passed in a steady rhythm of work. Jorge helped clean empty enclosures, labeled fresh supplies, and refilled water bowls throughout the facility. He worked with the same quiet efficiency he brought to his maintenance duties, paying close attention to detail and asking few but precise questions. Other staff members moved around them, greeting Marla and nodding politely to Jorge, but no one interrupted their routine. As they organized a storage shed, Marla outlined a possible schedule. "We need help most afternoons and weekends," she explained, sorting through a box of feeding dishes. "But we can be flexible. Some of our best volunteers started part-time while keeping their regular jobs." Jorge stacked clean bowls on a shelf, considering. Through the shed's window, he could see Lucky's enclosure. The raccoon had dragged his newspaper to a sunny spot and was methodically sorting through it, much like he used to arrange Jorge's tools in the maintenance room. "I could do afternoons," Jorge said finally, "and Saturdays." His voice was quiet, but certain. Marla nodded, not making a big moment of it. "We'll start you with basic care routines. Cleaning, feeding, supply management, things you're already good at. Later, if you're interested, we can train you for more specialized work." They finished organizing the shed in comfortable silence. Before Jorge left, Marla gave him a staff shirt and a set of keys to the supply areas. "See you Thursday?" she asked. Jorge nodded, clutching the shirt carefully. He took one last look at Lucky's enclosure before walking to his truck. The raccoon had fallen asleep in his patch of sunshine, one paw resting on a small wrench. That evening, Jorge returned to the apartment building and completed his usual rounds. A tenant in 5D had reported a stuck window, and he spent 40 minutes carefully freeing and lubricating the mechanism. The familiar work felt different now, not lesser, but part of a larger pattern rather than his entire world. In the basement maintenance room, Jorge hung his tool belt in its usual spot. The space felt different too, not empty anymore, but waiting. He took out the photo Marla had sent him, the one of Lucky with his tennis ball, and carefully pinned it to the wall beside the maintenance schedule he'd kept updated for years. The two documents made an odd pair, one full of times and tasks, the other showing a moment of quiet connection. Jorge stood there for a long moment, looking at them side by side. Then he sat down at his desk and began planning the next day's repairs, his movements sure and steady in the quiet room. A month had passed since Jorge first stepped through the gates of the Urban Wildlife Recovery Project. The rhythm of his days had shifted, finding a natural balance between his two worlds. Mornings still began in the familiar hallways of the apartment building, but now they carried a different energy, lighter somehow, more purposeful. Today, he started early as usual, thermos of coffee warming his hands as he made his first rounds. Mrs. Chen from 3B waved as he passed, actually stopping to thank him for fixing her kitchen sink last week. "It works perfect now," she said, smiling. "No more drips." Jorge nodded, offering a small smile in return. These interactions came easier now, less weighted with the awkwardness that used to cling to every tenant encounter. Even his movements seemed different, still careful and methodical, but flowing more naturally as he worked through his morning tasks. In 4C, he replaced a broken light switch, explaining the process to the elderly tenant who watched with interest. "You're different lately," Mr. Rodriguez observed, leaning on his cane. "More here." Jorge just shrugged, but he knew what the old man meant. Even Mr. Finch seemed to have softened somewhat. That morning, passing Jorge in the lobby, he actually paused to acknowledge the fresh paint job around the mailboxes. "Clean work," he said briefly before continuing on his way. It wasn't exactly warm, but it was more than the usual curt nod. The morning passed quickly, each repair flowing into the next. Jorge's tool belt felt lighter these days, though he carried the same equipment. Perhaps it was because he no longer carried the weight of isolation along with it. Around noon, while checking some exposed wiring near the back stairwell, Jorge heard the excited chatter of children in the courtyard below. Through the window, he could see a small group pointing at something in the trees. "Look, "A squirrel!" a young voice called out. "It's eating something!" Jorge didn't turn around, but a smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. He thought of the juvenile squirrels at the sanctuary, how Marla had taught him to prepare their special formula and monitor their weight gain. The knowledge felt like a secret treasure, making the ordinary sight of an urban squirrel somehow more meaningful. That afternoon, after changing into his sanctuary uniform, Jorge drove the familiar route to the Wildlife Recovery Project. The late summer sun warmed the dashboard of his truck as he pulled into the gravel parking lot. Other volunteers greeted him with casual waves. He was part of the routine now, no longer the quiet newcomer. He completed his usual afternoon tasks efficiently, cleaning enclosures, preparing food, checking water levels. Each job felt connected to the next, part of a larger purpose that extended beyond just maintaining things. When he finished his assigned duties, he took a small wrapped package from his truck. Lucky's enclosure was in its usual spot, shaded by the afternoon sun. The raccoon was awake, methodically sorting through a pile of enrichment toys Marla had left earlier. He looked up as Jorge approached, his movements unhurried but deliberate. Jorge unwrapped the package, revealing a small plastic toy wrench, similar to the real tools Lucky used to watch him work with. He placed it carefully through the feeding slot. Lucky examined it with his characteristic thoroughness, turning it over in his nimble paws several times. For a moment, the raccoon held the toy as if he might start mimicking Jorge's repair movements, just like he used to do in the maintenance room. But instead, he simply set it aside and moved closer to where Jorge sat beside the enclosure. Lucky curled up near the mesh, close enough that Jorge could feel the slight warmth of his presence against his knee. They sat together quietly, the afternoon light filtering through the trees above. Jorge didn't need to fill the silence with words anymore. The connection they shared had evolved into something different, but no less real. Two beings who had helped each other find their proper places in the world. As evening approached, Jorge completed his final maintenance checks at the apartment building. Instead of heading straight to his basement room, though, he found himself climbing the narrow stairs to the roof. He hadn't been up here since that rainy night when he first found Lucky. The rooftop looked different in the early evening light. The old HVAC unit stood silent, no longer hiding any secrets. The vent where he'd found Lucky was just a vent now, properly sealed and maintained. Jorge set his toolbox down and walked to the edge of the roof, looking out at the city skyline. The view hadn't changed, but he saw it differently now. The city felt less like a maze of mechanical problems to solve and more like a living ecosystem, one where even the smallest interactions could lead to unexpected connections. He stood quietly, listening to the familiar urban sounds, traffic below, distant sirens, the rustle of pigeons settling in for the night. There was no scratching noise, no sign of any wildlife seeking shelter. The roof was empty except for him, and that felt right somehow. Jorge lingered a moment longer than necessary, not really searching for anything, just allowing himself to remember. The panic of that first night, the weight of Lucky in his arms, the gradual transformation of a solitary routine into something richer and more meaningful. Finally, he picked up his toolbox and adjusted the brim of his old baseball cap, the same one he'd worn that rainy night. A small smile crossed his face as he turned toward the stairwell door. Without looking back, he descended into the quiet building, his footsteps echoing softly in the enclosed space. If you enjoyed the story of Jorge and Lucky, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.